We are in business and ready to go. So my window says that we're streaming on Facebook and I got the thumbs up. So hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and also for anybody who's joining this conversation through our Facebook Live event. We're really excited to be putting this on for all of you this afternoon. My name is Brittany Wallish. I'm the Executive Director of Black Dog Animal Rescue, which is headquartered in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The mission of Black Dog Animal Rescue is to promote, provide, and advocate for the needs of companion animals. And as an organization that's committed to the tenets of socially conscious sheltering, we also like to work to foster a culture of transparency, ethical decision-making, mutual respect, continued learning, and collaboration, which is some of the work that we'll be doing here together today. This community conversation is sponsored by the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, the Wyoming Humanities Council, and Denver University's Institute for Human-Animal Connection. And we'd just like to thank all of our sponsors for help bringing this great conversation to our Wyoming community today, or wherever you are if you're not in Wyoming. We, of course, are on Zoom, myself and our panelists, but our viewers are watching us live on Facebook. So we will invite you to engage with the conversation through the Facebook comments. And toward the end of the hour, we'll present our panelists with some of your comments or questions. My colleague Caitlin will be monitoring that thread for all of you, but just keep in mind that neither myself or our panelists can see it as we go through the conversation today. Throughout this conversation, we'll be making reference to the new documentary film Stray. Stray explores what it means to live as a being without status or security, following 3 dogs as they embark on inconspicuous journeys through Turkish society. Director Elizabeth Lowe's award-winning film is a critical observation of human civilization through the unfamiliar gaze of dogs and a sensory voyage into new ways of seeing. You can purchase a link to watch the film from home on our website at BDAR.org, but it is not necessary for you to have watched it in order to follow along with our conversation today. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and introduce each of our panelists. Dr. Mark Beckhoff is Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And our sympathies go out to you and your community today in Boulder, Dr. Beckhoff.
Thank you.
He has published 31 books, won many awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, compassionate conservation, and animal protection, and has worked closely with Jane Goodall and is a former Guggenheim Fellow. He also works closely with inmates of the Boulder County Jail. Mark and his colleague Jessica Pierce have a new book called A Dog's World, Imagining the Lives of Dogs in a World Without Humans, that will be published by Princeton University Press in the fall of 2021. In 1986, Mark won the Master's Aged Graded Tour de France. You can learn more about him at his homepage, markbeckhoff.com. Welcome, Dr. Bekoff.
Thank you.
Sloane Hawes is a research associate at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection at Denver University. She earned her master's in social work and animal-assisted social work certificate from the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work. In her studies at GSSW, she completed a concentration in sustainable development and global practice and explored concepts of One Health, cultural competence, and an ecosystems approach to community-based social work practice. She manages a social science research agenda examining the human community factors that inform companion animal welfare, with a particular interest in how animal welfare challenges intersect with human social and environmental justice issues. Thank you, Sloane.
Thank you.
Last, but certainly not least, Allie Mickelson is the Public Affairs Advisor for the Dumb Friends League in Denver, Colorado, where she leads the league's advocacy and policy work. Allie has been involved in the passage of a variety of animal welfare legislation, including helping to repeal breed-specific legislation in Denver, thank you for that, and improving Bureau of Animal Protection laws. She is also a co-leader of the League's work on socially conscious sheltering. Prior to her time at the League, she worked in tax and budget policy for 10 years at the Colorado Fiscal Institute. Allie has a JD and an LLM in taxation from the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. In her free time, she enjoys spending time outdoors with her husband, son, and twin daughters. She is also the parent of 2 dogs, a bunny, and 2 guinea pigs. And her 5-year-old son likes to say, her house has 10 hearts. And I love that. Also a big fan of guinea pigs over here, by the way.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. I'm just gonna start with a question and see where the afternoon takes us. Throughout the film, we see scenes of social unrest, protests, marches, and police presence. There's a lot of dialogue happening in the United States on these topics too. How does animal welfare fit into this picture? And in what ways have our relationships to companion pets changed in society as things have changed in the United States?
Anybody go?
I can hop in first and share out a little bit from our research perspective. We've been looking at how the role and function of animal shelters, animal protection agencies, and kind of your humane law enforcement agencies really has evolved over the course of time here in the United States. And I think that's reflected in the policies and programs that we have in place currently, compared to some of the tensions and the kind of stressful moments that we experienced when we watched the film, when we talk about kind of our Western view of what pet ownership looks like, and how there are differences in what we see in the film in terms of folks' relationship with animals. And so that's something I found myself reflecting on a lot, this particular question, while I was watching the film. Historically, the role of animal control agencies and humane law enforcement agencies in the United States has really been focused on companion animals, specifically cats and dogs, as potential public health and safety threats. Their ability to transmit zoonotic diseases like rabies, was a really early concern, and why these big sheltering organizations and animal protection agencies originated. And that has really evolved over time as we've started developing vaccinations for rabies, for example, and that zoonotic disease transmission piece has become less and less of an issue. And now, we see these animal sheltering and animal control agencies taking on more of a role in terms of the social components of companion animals in our life, less in this area of public health and more in this area of kind of our social relationships and how we think about our identities and all those things. So I get really interested from a research perspective of how that shift in the actual function of these organizations over time is reflected in our metrics and how we track our success. And for me, it really comes down to where it ties into kind of the social issues we're presented with today is, the policies and programs that were in place historically haven't changed that much, except for some of the amazing work that, Allie's engaging in on the policy level, and that Socially Conscious is really trying to address systemically. A lot of those old ways of we have these huge, brick and mortar facilities with kennels for cats and dogs, when we know that's not the best and most welfare enhancing environment for them. And we also have a lot of policies in place that are set to actually remove animals from their families instead of supporting those families and preserving them and preserving that bond that we benefit from today. And so I always find it in these moments of reflection, such as when we watch this documentary, where we're faced with really stark differences in our cultural paradigm around what pet ownership looks like. I want to remind myself there's actually those differences, those cultural differences in of paradigm of pet ownership that are happening even in our own country. And so that's a little bit of what I reflect on when I think about kind of what this moment in time is showing us in terms of social unrest. Is there's a lot of differences of opinion that are coming out in social media and in the news and in writing and in research. And I think this is a really important moment for us to be rethinking what's our history, where do we come from, where do we want to go, and what kind of systems and structures do we need to have in place to get us there. So if that helps us kick off the conversation, just acknowledging our history as animal welfare organizations was actually designed to remove companion animals from communities, not keep them there. And so I think that's an interesting thing to call out here.
I can kind of jump on that from the shelter perspective, because I think that Sloane has identified something that we are seeing as a cultural shift even in the shelter, is that our focus and our work is really expanding on how we can keep pets in the home. And we see more and more people who don't want to surrender their animal, but they can't access veterinary care, or they're worried about affording food. And I think that we're seeing, of course, that cycle go along with any other economic cycle. But COVID's been kind of weird, because more and more people are home and adopting pets and recognizing the need for a companion. But also we're in that sort of downturn in the economic cycle. So it's interesting to see how that is reflected in what sheltering services need to be provided, and how we can partner with the community to help, whether it's housing or low-cost veterinary care or pet food pantries. And it seems like that's going to be kind of the next face of sheltering. We've come a long way. I think of like Snoopy tied to his doghouse is like what we used to think of dogs, and now I see, you know, memes of dogs like with a martini glass on the couch. And you know, we've come a long way in the way we kind of visualize our animals at home. And so, you know, it's like Sloane is saying, we don't spend our resources now on trying to police dangerous dogs as much as we do trying to keep families together with their pets and support them in any way we can to really maintain that relationship.
This is all very foreign to me, so I'm absorbing all this good news. Yeah, yeah.
Sloane, you touched for a minute on the fact that there are even cultural differences in the United States in terms of pet keeping practices and the values we have around, you know, how we manage our pets at home. And I think for a long time, and when we were focused as an animal sheltering industry primarily on adoptions, we started to create a narrative about what constituted a responsible pet owner, or someone who should be having pets in their homes. And it seems to me now like maybe even that paradigm is beginning to shift, and we're starting to change our thinking. So can you talk a little bit, any of you, about what some of those paradigm shifts have been or are starting to look like? And also, you know, are there communities that haven't benefited from our work before that we could be serving better? And what does some of that look like?
I can jump in for a second. I think one of the things that one of the frameworks that we've kind of shifted in the sheltering community is that idea that only certain people deserve to have a pet. We know the health benefits of having a companion animal. It's, again, really amplified in a time of COVID when people are alone and they need to have a companion with them. There's so much research on the health benefits and all the different things. I mean, you know, kids are healthier and all the things that come along with pet ownership. And so it's interesting when you start to think about it's not pet ownership as not just something that a certain group of people should be able to do. Everyone should be able to benefit from that. So how can we support everyone? And it's a lot of, you know, the One Health work that Sloane does at DU, and a lot of that is kind of breaking down those barriers.
And I'll add, from a research-based perspective, the one thing that social work has learned in all the years that we've existed as an institution, and you know, there are a lot of parallels between the social work and human services field, you know, and what you would conceptualize as the animal services field, you know, including shelters, rescues, animal protection, humane law enforcement, you know, and what the research on the human side shows is that the most effective and sustainable way to promote the health of animals or people or the environment for that matter, if you're looking at it through this One Health lens that IHAC's research looks at it through, is to provide support, not punish folks for these differences, and to bridge those barriers that folks might experience to accessing, you know, basic veterinary care or behavior support. or just information that they need in order to, promote that bond and to achieve all of those maximum health benefits. There's also some negative impacts of our relationship with animals. Again, like the zoonotic disease transmission, like there's also some negative things that don't get talked about as much, I think, in the animal welfare world that are important to incorporate into our thinking. And, just noting that that support approach is that shift that we're seeing in the field of animal welfare right now. And it's really encouraging because of its ability to be a little bit more culturally humble, to kind of decenter that traditional definition of responsible pet owner, and be more inclusive, to be more supportive of communities who've either been either under-engaged by our organizations or frankly criminalized and punished for engaging with our organizations. So that's a shift that I think is informed by the broader social movements, but is also informed by just like research, like evidence-based practice. Support works, punishment does not.
Yeah, I mean, I would throw in, and oftentimes when I do, people say it's, well, of course it's implicit, but I think we need to make it explicit that I personally don't like the word ownership. I would rather use companionship, and I would stress the two-way interaction. It has to be beneficial for, if we're just talking about dogs, but it can be a cat or another support animal. It's got to be beneficial for the non-human as well. I mean, and once again, sometimes I say that and people just go, well, of course, but no, it's not of course. I mean, a lot of studies, no studies I know of, and I reviewed them a few months ago, show that it's 100% beneficial even for people. And then when you throw in the possibility that it's not working for people, and once again, you all know this much more, you know this better than I do on the ground, but I was just talking to somebody yesterday who I know, they've got a dog and they have to give the dog up. And turns out they got the dog from somebody who got the dog because the first person who got the dog basically hadn't done their homework. And they read all the stuff in the magazines and how dogs are good for you on this and that and the other thing. And turned out that it wasn't. They had no idea what it meant to live with a dog. They had no idea that their whole life would be changed. So anyway, you all know this, but that's sort of what my message is when we talk about welfare or well-being, that it's a two-way street. And I do have people writing to me saying, oh, I've got this going on in my life and this going on in my life, blah, 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 blah. What do you think about my getting a dog? And first of all, the first thing I say is, I need to see it all firsthand. I mean, I've got to be there. It's not that I don't believe them, but people describe stressful situations and positive situations really rather differently. So that's my 2 cents. And like I said, for y'all, that's just, sort of, I think to me, for the people I know who work in shelters and other places, that's kind of like sheltering 101. So I just want to throw that out.
Yeah, I was going to say that's something I really value about the socially conscious framework, of their recognition of the importance of working in collaboration with communities in terms of defining what programs are needed and how those programs roll out. It's an approach that we try to utilize when we're doing research on this topic, to really make sure that underrepresented or really historically excluded voices are heard in that data collection process and in establishing what best practice is, and what best practices are isn't established by just a few voices, like just those in position of leadership, or really established by people who don't even live in the communities that are being served by the programs. And that is a piece that I think is a strength of the socially conscious framework. So I don't know, Allie, if you can share more about why that emerged as an important tenet of socially conscious. I think it kind of ties into what Mark is talking about, of just like recognizing like we need to know the whole story. We can't just look at like little tiny snippets of it.
Well, plus,
yeah, I'd be happy. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
No, but plus, no, you're right. And you put it much more succinctly than I could, because I don't work in this field. But plus, to me, the first thing that I like to hear is there's a dog involved. There's a non-human involved here. So frankly, it may benefit the person, but if the non-human, say the dog in this situation, goes on to have a crappy life, that person shouldn't have a dog. I mean, I really, really feel that way. And so I like I said, and you've probably seen many more cases, but maybe people come to me when there's a problem and say, my goodness, I got a dog and I have no idea what to do. And I had no idea it was going to be a life changer. So the dog makes me, this is them, feel better, but they are perceptive enough to know that the dog is not having a good time, if you will. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that you're making, and I think it's a line that we have to consider a lot, which is the kind of line between responsible pet ownership or companionship, right. and thinking about that, what that means to the individual. One of the things that Sloane mentioned is socially conscious sheltering. That's something that is a framework of sort of tenets that shelters across the country and rescues have been adopting. It includes a lot of different sort of ideals or goals around how to kind of provide these best outcomes for pets. It's something that is kind of relevant to what we're saying, because it's really meant to flip sheltering and just really think about how do we give individualized attention to each and every cat and dog that comes through our door, instead of how can we have this or how can we have this method, or how can we count these numbers, or how can we do this. This is really meant to say we need to treat each and every animal with individualized attention. And one of the interesting things that has happened with socially conscious sheltering is it's also meant to be driven by community input. And I think we know, anyone who works in policy knows that when the community is the one driving your agenda, it really makes a huge difference, and it builds trust within your community, and it lands, you know, it's just more beneficial to everyone involved. And it kind of made me think about the movie, because the community needs in the movie are so different, and the way that they treat the pets, even just dogs roaming around stray, are so different than we would do that if we saw stray dogs in Denver, right? And so, you know, the way that a socially conscious shelter would work in Turkey or Istanbul is totally different than it would work in the United States. And I think that's an important part of sheltering, is looking back and saying, what do we need? What is our community asking for? And how do we be responsive to that? We've been talking about this to places all over the country. There's places that they don't have pet overpopulation. There's places on the East Coast that are like, how can we get more pets here? And so if you had a shelter there that had their whole mission similar to ours about ending pet overpopulation, it wouldn't make any sense. And so we see a lot of different kind of community-based missions that will work with socially conscious sheltering. And that's one of the things that kind of made me reflect on in the movie, is because it really is, even when we're looking at human or animal sheltering, it really has to be tailored to the individual community, because they're just so different.
I really love how you tied the model into how it would look different, you know, here versus in Turkey or on the streets of Istanbul. And it made me think too about the fact, like, what the individual animals need. I don't perceive that my pets at home could live the lifestyle that the dogs that we're following in the Stray documentary could live. And we have this very Western way of looking at animals, that they only have intrinsic value if they're closely tied to a human, that there's an existing relationship with a human, and therefore the animal has value. And I'm wondering if we can talk about, you know, how that looks in our country and in other places. And Mark, I know that you probably have some insight into this. Dogs don't necessarily need us in a lot of ways. And I think that the film kind of clearly shows that. So we're talking a lot about how much we want pets to get through the pandemic crisis, but also pets have needs. And that it's sort of a relationship that you have with the animal. And I think it's really interesting to talk about when we say best outcomes and best practices, we're framing that in very much a sort of a Western way of animal keeping. And there's probably different ways to look at that. What does it mean to be best outcome for the animal?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually why we wrote our book. I mean, we started thinking about the book that's coming out, Imagining the Lives of Dogs in a World Without Humans, because it really makes you reflect on our relationship with, you know, I'm just going to say dogs, but any animal could be substituted. Now, how it evolved from the past and where it's going in the future. Most people are only really familiar with homed dogs, if you will, and home, you know, mean they have a home. They don't, maybe not always there. Home, a home dog means something different in India and China and East Africa than it does maybe in a lot of places in the United States. But there's almost 1 billion dogs in the world. And if 70% are give or take free ranging, you're talking about 700 million dogs with whom most people aren't familiar, including researchers. Because that is my sideshow, is that people talk about all the research done on dogs, you know, highly controlled and very, some are elegant lab studies. But then they make these generalizations that dogs do this or dogs don't do this or dogs can't do this. And I'm thinking, really? Go watch a pack of dogs in Kenya or in southern India. I mean, and or my students who studied feral and free-ranging dogs in the in the four corners here. There's Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. I mean, these dogs do really well on their own. And so I think that we really need to focus on individual dogs, the individual humans, and the nature of their relationship. I mean, of all the dogs I lived with over the years, I think many, not all, but most would do really well if I weren't around. I mean, would they miss me? Yeah, I'd like to think they'd miss me. But sometimes I think I'd miss them more than they'd miss me. But the real bottom line is, once again, this individuality. And that's a focus of a lot of research projects, that there's individual differences among litter mates. You all know this, but when I talk to people about this, even people who have lived with dogs, some of them don't realize that. You know, I always tell them that when young coyotes and young wolves come out of the den in the wild, they're as different as you can imagine. And they've all been in the same hole in the ground with the same mommy and sometimes dads around, and with the same litter mates and siblings. So yeah, I mean, so I don't want to just keep going on this stream, but I do think people need a refresher course in the notion of individuality and the notion that people who write about dogs, I know people who write about dogs and have never seen a free-ranging dog or free-running dog, even at a dog park. So do they know dogs? Yeah, they know dogs in laboratories, and they know dogs at home, and they know dogs on leashes. But I think one of the things that comes to me, because I'm not in this field and people ask, is when you're all working in shelters, put dogs in homes, I mean, it's hard to know what kind of life they're going to have. I don't mean quality necessarily, but are they going to be able to run free? Or are they going to be on a leash all the time? Or are they going to be with a helicopter human who only knows to say no, 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 no? And the dog is going, what the hell's going on here? I mean, I'm trying to help you and also have a dog's life. So that would, you know, yeah.
Yeah, and Mark, just to tie it back into the sheltering and the animal protection field, you know, I think the best example of this, I know we're kind of talking about dogs for the purpose of this film because they focused on dogs, but, you know, that concept of our valuation of animals being highly dependent upon their relationship with humans, I think the closest example that I use and I hear a lot about on the conference circuit is the issue of community cats and cats who live outside, either, you know, because they're owned by someone or they live in a home and sometimes they're outside to go hunting or go on their adventures, or because they're actually feral and they've lived outside their entire lives. It's like this really interesting loophole in terms of when we talk about, you know, best outcomes for animals. Traditionally, because of our concern about public health and public safety, the best outcome has actually been removing that animal from the natural ecosystem that they live in, that they support through their predation activities. I'm sure I'm making the bird people upset right now, and that's not my intention. My point being, if you're looking at our animal welfare and our community, our system as an entire system, truly through that One Health lens, that knows that those outcomes, the health outcomes for animals, are interconnected with the health outcomes for people and with the environment, that valuation system becomes pretty ironic when it becomes a system, in the case of community cats, where we are impounding these cats because they're violating leash laws, and then we're euthanizing them. And we're saying that's our way of demonstrating that we care for animals, that we care for cats.
Right.
And so I love, I really like this kind of shift towards thinking about animals as individuals, because I think that is a lot more aligned with this framework around interconnectedness. And kind of decentering these like sort of traditional narratives of what responsible pet keeping looks like, because there's a lot of diversity of opinion around that issue. And I truly feel like that's the way you promote interconnectedness, is you allow for that diversity of relationship and for that ecosystem to evolve organically. You don't, superimpose these, kind of arbitrary guideposts around it. That's when you start breaking down systems, and the systems lose their resilience. And I'm getting a little bit more theoretical than I'd like to about this, but this is a lot of what we think about as macro social workers in the concentration that I focused in on around sustainable development. We really think hard about how do you set up systems to promote the resilience of communities, and that's looking at communities for their strengths, not necessarily their deficits. Look at the things that are going well, look at the things that occur naturally in our relationships with other people and in our relationships with animals and the environment, and empower those things to just continue to grow. And I think sometimes shelters and animal control and humane law enforcement, we get in the way. And we really need to rethink that, again, that question about what is the best outcome, what does welfare look like? For our whole community, not just necessarily for this one little narrow subset of community cats or dogs who live in homes. Or I love that moment in the film where the street dog is sitting on the sidewalk and the little dogs walk by with the coats and their leashes, and the dog's like, what are you doing? I just I pictured a whole conversation happening there about what are you wearing? And that dog being like, aren't you cold? And just all of this stuff being augmented through this lens of what is life, what's a good life look like for an animal?
Can I say one more thing? Because and then I want to hear from others. I think you said two things that I really love as a field biologist, and that's allowing for diversity. I mean, we can put that into the social realm in terms of humans, but allowing for diversity. Coyotes aren't the same, sometimes, who live only a kilometer away. So once again, you start talking about the coyote or the wolf, and all of a sudden you realize that you're really talking about an individual who doesn't really exist. The other that you said, which is something we follow really deeply in our book, is allowing ecosystems to evolve. These animals who are outside are part of an ecosystem. And when I talk to people, maybe Boulder's unique that way, but they really like that. They are part of an ecosystem, even if they're on a lead. They're peeing, and other dogs come by, and other dogs sniff it, and that's part of the ecosystem. Or they're running free, and they're changing the space use of other animals, including foxes who are in town. And so I love what you just said, because when you start to take that broad, more holistic ecosystem approach, sometimes people will go, yeah, you're right. I don't really like when in this case, a dog or cat does it, but they are part of an ecosystem, and ecosystems are an evolving, dynamic entities. They're not stable. So when people say, oh, I don't like my dog just did that, and I'm thinking, well, you can do one of two things. You can tell your dog not to do it, or you can accept the fact that they've become part of an evolving ecosystem. And as a field biologist, that's where I want people to go. I want people to know walking down Pearl Street with a dog on a lead is influencing the behavior of not only other dogs and maybe other animals, including humans. And I think when people start taking that broad view, they begin to appreciate the individual dog for who they really are, not some puppet on a lead. Anyway, don't get me going on this. But thank you for that. That's really important. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I have to admit, I am not, in the research field of this. And so I was a ball of nerves through that whole movie, because speaking of helicopter parenting, here's my dog and my pajama pants, don't tell. But I was a ball of nerves through that whole movie, because it was like, I think as a compassionate pet owner, I was like, oh my gosh, somebody needs to take care of these dogs, and somebody needs to, it can't be these kids in the movie, because they're not equipped to take care of themselves. And I was so concerned about that. But it's interesting to hear your perspective, because it really highlights that is more something that I am putting on those dogs, and is more about my relationship with how I think of pet companionship. And isn't necessarily reflective of the community. And I think that's one of the really powerful parts of that movie, is that it kind of evokes all different emotions. And for me, it was like really stressful, but I think maybe for others, it was like really kind of peaceful and nice to watch these journeys. And so it's kind of an interesting shift for me.
Yeah, no, that's what you said is really important. I mean, that was my take, because I've been around dogs like that. And I mean, they have problems, but so too do home dogs. I mean, veterinarians would be out of a job if home dogs were healthy and happy. And so, I mean, when I've been with these groups of I call them free ranging, because that's what they are. Some go home at night. Dogs like in southern India, I mean, they do really well. Do some have mange? Yeah, they do. But I saw a dog recently on Pearl Street who had mange, who probably had a life that I might like to have, but they do okay, and they're not aggressive. They're no more aggressive than other dogs. They form really friendly relationship with people. The people, and it's very enriching for the people. And dogs living outside of Rome, for example, there's people who cook for them every day. There's people whose lives are affected by those free-ranging dogs, and they cook meals for them. And that I've heard them define their own worth in terms of the food they give these dogs who don't have homes. So there's that cultural aspect again, but there's that aspect again that a dog isn't a dog isn't a dog, and we've got to we just got to get away from that.
Yeah, and this is where I make the shameless plug for, again, kind of rethinking our metrics as sheltering organizations towards more of a One Health orientation. So recognizing our purpose is to serve animals and promote health and welfare of animals, but that we're probably best positioned to achieve that goal if we're also considering the human and the environmental components of that system. And I want to be clear, when I say One Health and Welfare, I don't mean One Health and Welfare through the human-centered or animal-centered lens. So not just being happy that I have positive environmental and human health outcomes because I also have a super high live release rate. I mean, truly decentering any kind of one group being held as a higher level of weight as another, of truly thinking about this as a balanced, interconnected system that needs to be considered equally. That's where these kind of social justice and equity concepts come into to the research that I do, is recognizing that unless you achieve, kind of engage in this kind of interconnected One Health frame, there will be trade-offs, and you will be creating an inequitable system where the existing inequities persist. And so that's another layer, kind of, Brittany, when you ask about our valuation system, I think it's really important to note that a lot of our systems are human-centered. They were developed to promote the health and welfare of people. They were not developed to promote the health and welfare of animals or the environment. And so we really need to think hard about how our existing programs and policies, which now I think in sheltering are actually shifting more towards being designed to promote the health and welfare of animals, despite what they might, how they might, marginalize or even criminalize certain people. And so there's a lot of this kind of lack of balance happening in terms of what we're valuing. And I really feel like this One Health, One Welfare from a research perspective, but also from a practice perspective, can help us just call ourselves out on those moments and try to achieve a little bit more of this equilibrium that Mark and I are espousing. around ecosystems.
Well, what you just said really is a great way of looking at it. I'm a big fan of the One Health, say the One Health move, and I never put it together. And I was just sitting here laughing. I mean, I'm not that dumb, but I mean, seriously, this woman who I know in Italy who makes food and says it makes me feel good. That's a One Health. That's a One Health perspective. She got devastated when these dogs weren't around, worrying that they had been hit by cars, shot by humans, whatever. But it's her day. She gets up in the morning, makes breakfast, makes the food for the dog, goes out, and it makes her feel good. And that is One Health in that sense, in that ecosystem, right? I mean, that's the way I look at it, and there's a woman in Denver who had a very similar relationship with the geese down here before Wildlife Services murdered so many of them. She had some deep psychological problems, had therapy. She became very friendly with the geese. She didn't need the therapy, but when the geese were shot and taken away, she needed it again. And I never really had put that into that One Health frame, but that's really what it was all about. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I think that that's what happened. I mean, parts of Stray, you could look at the body language and the facial expressions of the humans. They were getting a kick out of these dogs. And they would be very upset if somebody harmed them. I mean, I saw an interaction in China once that blew my mind, and I don't speak Chinese, but somebody was being really nasty to a street dog, and people came around, and that person, I felt it, or I had no idea what they were saying other than their body language, was really putting their welfare and well-being in jeopardy, because what they were doing to a dog who was just kind of lying out there, a dog who I'd see a lot of the days. So, yeah. Anyway, this is great for me.
It's really interesting how your culture or your your background really shapes your values when it comes to animals. And if I can switch gears just a little bit, I'd like to ask, maybe Allie, you could talk to us a little bit about how do we use public policy to how are we evolving policy to reflect our changing values for the animals in our communities? I think that's for me, policy is the most powerful tool we have, at least in the United States, to evolve, what we're doing, what our work is doing alongside those values as those animals, the role that they play in our lives continues to shift. So can you talk a little bit about, what happens in the political sphere, and how have the politics changed our relationship to and with animals over time?
It's such a great question, and it's really after my heart, because I'm also a big believer in making change through policy. But to be honest, what I'm finding is this is an unfamiliar area for a lot of policymakers. They have a frame. Everybody has a pet, and they know that, and they know they love and care for animals, and that their constituents love and care for animals, but they don't always know who to talk to about policies that come their way. We see a lot of different legislators who will reach out to us because they have a constituent who says, my neighbor is tethering their dog for 8 hours a day, and that should be illegal. And then they say, yeah, it should be. And then they reach out to us without kind of realizing the implications and the differences between different kinds of, pets and different parts of the state and where you have your pet, and that there's so many more implications. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do is just work with policymakers to build sort of a set of, and really it's a list of experts and resources that they can reach out to better understand these issues, because it isn't something that is naturally intuitive beyond, I think, what we've kind of identified. I have a dog and I let it sleep in my bed or something like that. But policy is so many more implications than something like that. One of the other things that's been really interesting, and I imagine this is also reflective of Wyoming, is we see a lot of different kind of reactions to animal welfare policy, depending on if you're in a more urban area versus a more rural area. And I don't want to imply that one or the other cares more for their pets, but we tend to see in a more rural area, you have more of a working relationship sometimes with your pets, even though I think probably a lot of those working dogs sleep in people's beds as well. But we cross some kind of tricky lines when it comes to things like livestock or horses, or what is a companion animal? What should you be able to do with your companion animal? And so that's a really interesting place where politics and animal welfare are kind of evolving. And I think that, pun intended, everyone kind of gets their hackles up around it whenever they hear animal welfare. But it's been interesting to sort of see how this conversation is evolving, and the way that the sort of livestock and farm bureau representatives are finding to work with more rural shelters and law enforcement and things like that, because it's a similar goal. It's just like we're talking about. It's a different perspective and a different kind of cultural upbringing and thought pattern. And so the policy world, I would maybe say, is a step behind where we are, but it's not for lack of effort. It's just because I think my dog's gonna weigh in, of course. But I think it's just because they're learning, and she's got a lot of opinions. Don't worry about that.
And Allie, just to piggyback on that, I think one of the struggles in the policy realm is the lack of data and established kind of best practices, or even just evidence-based decision-making in general, right? Like, it's usually a very small group of folks, very outspoken, that have a very specific and potentially emotional reason for driving a particular policy agenda. And, there's not a lot of really great data in the animal sheltering and animal control areas. I mean, that's been the huge, kind of revolution, if you will, over the last 10 years, is just having standardized data collection. Like, we literally have only a few national databases for these data to live in, and animal control agencies and humane law enforcement don't have one. It's just sheltering right now that has a national database to report out this information. And that's it's a huge issue from a research perspective, but also from a policy perspective, because it's hard to make decisions about which policies to move forward if you don't know which one's going to achieve the outcome that you're going for, right? And the most sustainable and cost effective, and add in all those layers that have to go into making a good policy. I think it's a really exciting revolution that's happening in the field of animal welfare, that more data is being collected. And not to sound like a broken record of this, but continue to ask those questions about what data are we collecting? Is it just live release rate data, or are we also collecting data about environmental health outcomes or human health outcomes attached to our programming? And also, who's reporting those data? Who are we collecting it from? Are the people that are actually not engaging with our organization even being represented in our data set? There's a lot of layers to this when you try to do a really good research project to inform really good policy that, honestly, IHAC just starts from scratch on, of like, okay, well, we're just going to have to collect this data starting now, and we'll be able to track this moving forward. But that's, I think, a challenge in the policy realm too, is just the presence of good research.
I think also, when I talk to certain people, I never use the word welfare, and I almost never use the word well-being, because it's a turn off, and I certainly don't talk about animal rights. I talk about health. I talk about the dog's physical as well as emotional health. And sometimes when you say that, people will go, oh, yeah. And then I'll say, oh, do you think your dog likes to play? Uh-huh. Well, doesn't your dog feel joy? Uh-huh. And do you think your dog suffers pain, psychological? And sometimes there's a hesitation with certain people, but I find that that's a really good avenue in, because the minute they hear the word welfare, especially if you're from Boulder, but seriously, they'll go, oh, you're some animal rights nut. And I'll go, that might be true, but that's not what I'm saying now. What I'm saying now is that we need to be concerned with the health of your dog, their physical and their emotional well-being. And I really mean that. And I've used that as a bridge. And I know you talk about this and hear about this empathy gap, using dogs as a good example for bridging that gap. Well, if your dog enjoys playing, why wouldn't a wolf or a coyote or another animal? I've found that to be really effective in a very non-confrontational way, just to say, look, this is what's happening here. And then tying that back into the responsible guardianship. When you choose, you make that choice to live with the dog and stuff. So, I mean, I think there's ways around, and that those are cultural differences. I mean, I having studied coyotes for 8.5 years in Jackson Hole, when you leave the confines of where we were studying and go elsewhere, it's a different culture in the county surrounding where Jackson Hole is. But that's okay. You can talk to these people as long as you're nice to them and you explain what they're doing. So I think, I mean, this is a really valuable discussion for me because it always comes back to me that words and attitudes and the way in which you present yourself really matters. I mean, it's sometimes people get upset with me because I'm being too nice to somebody who's not nice. And I'm going, well, you ain't going to get them to change their mind if you fight fire with fire, for example. Yeah. I mean, you all do amazing work. You do. I sometimes shudder when I think if I had to do what you do.
Well, you just queued us up for what's likely to be probably my last question of the group before we look at the audience here for a minute. We've just got a few minutes left together this afternoon. And I wanted to ask each of you individually to reflect on this last question and provide your input. The film's director said of the featured dogs that they are, quote, emblems of resistance, living manifestations of compassion in the face of intolerance, unquote. What does it mean to be compassionate? And how can people, organizations, and communities begin to expand on this work?
That's a lot.
Wow.
Is that on your sheet that you sent?
No, I added that one in. Well, it's a version of it.
Yeah, so say the quote again.
The quote is that the dogs are emblems of resistance. They are living manifestations of compassion in the face of intolerance. And we just had a conversation about data and policy, and all of that is critically important to our work, but so is the way people feel about it. And so my question to you is, what does it mean to be compassionate? And how can people embrace this in their own communities to develop on this work?
I mean, go ahead, Mark. You first.
Go ahead. You want to start? No, I was just to say, I know there's a difference between compassion and empathy. I always think, and I ask people to do this, put yourself into the paws, if you will, or the head or the heart of these animals. Think about what life is like for them, and if we're talking about these stray animals, how would your dog do out there, and why, or why would they do well, or why wouldn't they do well? And just try to imagine what their lives are like. And I also say to them, they're not bothering you. People will say, they poop here and they pee here. Well, so do home dogs. Just walk around the streets of Boulder. In fact, a few days ago when I was on a bike ride, we were counting the number of plastic bags that were dropped where people go, oh, I'll come back and get them. No, a very small percentage comes back. And when someone says, oh, I'll come back and get it, and I see they're carrying a bag or something with them, I'll say, well, why don't you just drop it in your bag now? I said, do you do the same route out and back? And sometimes they get really upset because they don't. They do a circle. They're not coming back to it. They drop their bag. But I do ask these people to imagine what the lives of these dogs are like, and what can you do to make their lives better. And tolerance is really key. They're not bothering you. And stuff. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Brittany. I just
Well, there's no right or wrong answer to any of it, but I think that tolerance is definitely a value that we could extend to all living things, maybe a little bit more than we're currently in the practice of doing.
Absolutely.
Sloane, what do you think when you think about compassion and how we can, what does it mean and how do we expand on it in the work that we do?
Yeah, for me, compassion is a little bit of a tricky word. I'll just be honest, because I feel like it's been so weaponized and so kind of exploited, if you will, to advance the agenda of just a few, right? Like it's almost been used as kind of like we're acting with compassion and therefore, it doesn't matter if there are negative implications of our actions, if there's some folks who aren't benefiting from our work, or there's certain animals that continue to be euthanized because we're coming from a place of compassion. So it's almost used to some extent to kind of excuse negative implications of programmings that are quote unquote coming from a good place. And so for me, that's why I think about, again, tolerance is kind of a hard word too. I'm like, kind of, what is the other word I want to leave with? I don't know that I have one. But I would just say that what it means to be compassionate is more than just having a narrow view, right? For me, being compassionate means decentering my lived experience, honoring my lived experience and honoring where I come from and how it informs my personal values, but recognizing that I also have a duty to honor anyone else that I interact with or any other animal I interact with, and kind of acting from this framework that social work teaches us around cultural humility. So being humble about where I come from and others, or where others are coming from in an interaction. And so I think there's a lot of room for that in terms of when we talk about sheltering and animal control and humane law enforcement policy around, again, thinking about where we came from historically, being focused on public safety and public health. But now we're at this place where we have these really strong relationships with these animals, and there are still continuing to be humans who don't get to have relationships with these animals or are criminalized because of their relationship with animals. And so there is still a long way for us to go, frankly, from this more diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, for us to really get to a place of what I would consider to be true compassion or true tolerance, where we're not using that as like a sword to justify our actions and the negative impacts, but that we really truly are engaging in compassion and like more through this one health, one welfare lens of balancing those outcomes and not kind of justifying trade-offs.
What you said reminds me of the way people use humane, and we talk about humane washing. There's compassion washing.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I what you said is so true. And if you get 20 people in a room, you might get 25 different answers. Anyway, I think you want to go to your group here, Brittany.
Yeah, Allie, do you have anything that you'd like to add to this conversation? And Sloane, thank you for that. Let me go back and forth here. I like that the way that you frame the word is not, it's problematic, but there's also, you can see where work can be done. So that to me creates a hopeful picture of the problem, because we can see a direction we can move in to sort of tackle the problematic pieces of it. And that creates hope. And I think that's really great. Allie, how about you kind of close us out? We're going to go over just a little bit of time. Hopefully you guys have a couple extra minutes to stick around, and we'll get us wrapped up here in just a little bit. But please take your time, Allie, with this response. You've got all the time you need.
Well, I'll try to be quick, but I think of compassion from a little bit of a different lens, because compassion is a big part of our mission at DFL. I mean, if you've seen the Dumb Friends League logo, it says compassion always. And when you asked that question, I thought about when I interviewed to work at the Dumb Friends League, they ask everybody what their definition of compassion is. And I'm sure I wrote out this long, answer that was poetic and meant so much to me. But now when I think of compassion, it's a lot of what I see in the shelter. And I mean, we have such incredible people there that have devoted their whole life to not only making sure, I almost feel like the easier part of animal welfare is being compassionate about our animals. Sometimes the harder thing is to have compassion for the humans that are making the really tough choices in our shelters. And the people who I see exhibit just what compassion means to me are often the people who have to intake dogs in a judgment-free environment and make people feel comfortable with that decision, because we know that's the best thing for the dog. And that takes such a level of compassion for both recognizing, you know, the need of the dog and wanting to be able to take care of that animal, but also that there's a need in that human, and that person is making the choice, and a tough choice that they think is the best for their pet, or maybe, you know, what they consider their family member. And so seeing that side of the compassion is really special. And I think a lot of times it's easier for us to get to the compassionate side for the animals. And in all cases, it would be great if we could extend that compassion a little bit more to the people, because I think for some reason that's a harder leap for us to make.
That was really great. Thank you. We actually don't have a lot of questions. We have some questions in the comments that are really specific to shelter operations and programs, which I think is a little in the weeds for today's conversation. But the rest of it is just really lovely dialogue, a lot of appreciation for you all and your time. And I certainly share that sentiment. This has just been a delightful conversation, and thank you all today for showing up for it. So I'm going to wrap us up, but I just want to thank again each of you for your time and expertise today, being so generous with all of that. Also to our sponsors, again, who've helped us raise awareness for this event and bring this critical conversation to our community. I think that's really powerful. And for those who showed up at 3:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday to watch this panel, thank you for that too. We will be recording and editing this video and then putting it up on Black Dog's YouTube channel later in the week. So we'll be sure to post that on the Facebook page and send it out to each of you to share if you like. And that's probably it for the day. So